When the sun of the Roman Empire set, night enveloped the entire continent. Night was not merely the absence of day, but the absence of certainty. Roads collapsed, bridges crumbled, and chaos reigned in the once thriving cities. People looked around them with trembling hearts, not knowing what might come from the forest, from the road, or even from the sky. In that heavy silence, new sounds rose. The neighing of horses, the clang of swords, the sound of ironclad footsteps. The night had appeared not a saint, nor a ruler, but an armed shadow protecting the small villages, sowing fear as well as security. Night wrapped itself around every house like a blanket of fear. The small fire burning in a distant hut looked like a faint star hanging at the edge of the earth. And from there, the story begins. As the night deepened, the fortresses rose like stony specters guarding the void from afar. The towers appeared like rigid fingers pointing to the sky. But up close, they were nothing but cold, silent walls, above which flickered the dim light of torches within. Time did not seem to move faster. The footsteps of the guards on the walls where the sounds echoed like a heavy rhythm, the bells breaking the village silence below. There, in the stone halls, knights huddled around the great hearth, flames dancing on their impassive faces, while wolf skins and ballet banners from ancient battles hung above their heads. By day, the knight polished his armor to impress the peasants. But at night he sat meditating, drinking wine to warm his fear, remembering that the forest was stronger than iron and that death could knock without warning. As for the peasants in the huts below the castle, they slept under the illusion of protection, believing the high wall was enough to keep out chaos. But the knight laughed mockingly, for iron could repel a sword. But it could not repel disease, hunger, or the stories that grew in the darkness. At the foot of the hill, far from the high towers, the peasants lived their lives as if they were veins clinging to the earth. They awoke with the first glimmer of dawn, grasping their wooden plows and planting them in the damp mud, while the mist wrapped around their legs like a cold shawl. They worked until their bodies ached and their arms grew heavy, then returned at sunset to their homes. Small huts of wood and straw, their smoke barely rising above the nearby trees. Around a dim fire, the family gathers. A piece of black bread is shared, a thin soup is divided among them, and then the stories begin. The mother whispers to her children about a patron saint, a knight from afar, or a monster lurking in the forest. Her words are not mere stories, but invisible walls she builds around her children's sleep to shield them from fear. But the peasant himself sleeps with one eye half open, a wooden stick beside him, a door locked with a rusty nail, and an ear ready for any nighttime knock. He knows that darkness hides more than it reveals, and that the stories he tells his children might rise in the night and walk among them in the darkness of Europe. Sleep is not an escape from fear, but one of its faces. Beyond the village walls, the forest begins, a world unto itself, denser than any wall and more silent than any fortress. The trees intertwine with their tall branches, blocking out the moonlight, turning night into a deeper darkness and day into a long shadow. It ends. People didn't see the forest as a habitat for nature, but as a stage for evil. They said that wandering souls, who couldn't find their way to heaven, dwelt there. There, sorcerers hide, performing their rituals among the tree trunks. There, the devil passes disguised as an animal or a wayfarer. In its muddy paths, legends of werewolves, ogres, and old women who lure passers-by arose. Even the wind, as it blew through the branches, sounded like a human moan. Every step in the forest was a gamble. One might encounter a hungry wolf, lurking bandits, or simply an endless wandering. Yet, the peasant had no escape from it. He entered it to gather firewood or to hunt a wild rabbit, apprehensive at every moment. He knew that the darkness was not limited to what his eyes saw, but extended to what the forest suggested to his mind and heart. And so, the forest became the mother of legends, the source of fear, and the hearth of imagination that lit the nights of Europe for centuries. In the heart of this night, the knight appeared. He was not merely a man on horseback, but an image where reality and symbolism intertwined. His iron armor gleamed under the torchlight, and his helmet concealed his features, leaving only a cold shadow. The peasants watched. He gazed at him as a child gazes at a sacred statue, half fear, half hope. But the knight's life was not as people imagine. Behind the gleaming armor lay a weary body and a burdened soul. He spent his days training, repeatedly slicing through the air with his sword until his arms stiffened. At night, he remained vigilant, fearing a sudden attack. He would hastily eat a piece of dry meat or drink a cup of wine, then sit in contemplation, listening to the wind whistling through the towers, as if reminding him that iron cannot repel everything. The knight is law personified. His sword is the judge, his shield the last bastion. But he is also a man who knows his death could come from a stray arrow or a mysterious illness. Therefore, he lived between two opposing forces: by day, an outward show of strength; by night, a whisper of weakness. The villagers saw in him the promise of protection, while he saw himself as just another soldier in an endless battle deep within the castles. Night had its own distinct flavor. Long corridors wound like stony intestines, lit by a few torches whose flames flickered with every gust of wind. Every footstep echoed between the thick walls. The castle itself breathed slowly. In the grand halls, huge hearths burned, around which knights and nobles gathered. Tables were laden with hastily roasted meats, loaves of hard bread, and goblets of wine passed from hand to hand. But this abundance did not conceal the truth. Food was not always guaranteed, and famine knocked on the castle doors as it did on the doors of the ports. Women sat on high benches, weaving or exchanging stories, while children ran through the corridors, laughing, then stopping abruptly when they bumped into a stern grandfather or a distracted knight. The knights, between cup and sword, spoke of tomorrow's battles, of lands to be conquered, of attacks to come. Possible or perhaps monsters, they say, were seen in the nearby forest. But when everyone retreats to their rooms, the castle remains a dark mass facing the wind. The sounds of iron vanish, leaving only the creaking of doors and the meowing of stray cats seeking warmth in a corner. Then everyone in the castle knows that sleep is but a brief respite before night resumes its eternal siege. Night in Europe was not content with darkness and fear. It carried within it a silent enemy more dangerous than swords and wolves. In small villages, a single cough in a cramped hut was enough to spread among everyone. They would go to sleep at night and wake to a fever that ravaged their bodies. There were no medicines to speak of, only herbs boiled in rusty pots or prayers recited in the hope that the fever would leave as it came. Death was a familiar guest, entering the house unannounced, taking a child, a woman, or an old man, then leaving as it came. And when night fell, candles were lit near the beds and eyes watched. Shivering under the blankets, everyone was on tenterhooks, anticipating the sound of breath that could cease at any moment. In the cities, the situation was even more dire. The air, thick with smoke and foul odors, made epidemics more vicious. Plague, smallpox, and fever-heavy words passed around like news of invasions. Night did not extinguish the pain of illness, rather, it intensified it. Silence amplified the moans, and darkness brought death closer. Therefore, the fear of night was not limited to the thieves and wolves it concealed, but also to the ailments the body itself might hide, waiting to be exposed. Thus, sleep in those times became like a journey into the unknown, either a new awakening or an eternal absence. In the heart of this dense night, the sound of bells rose from monasteries and churches, as if in a small attempt to dispel the gloom. For many, the church was a refuge from endless fear. Within its stone walls and beneath its high, cross-adorned ceilings, the peasant found a solace that neither sword nor fortress could offer. In their rough clothes and with their pale faces, they spent their nights in ceaseless prayer, lighting candles and chanting slow melodies that echoed through the corridors. Their words, even if incomprehensible to the common folk, seemed like an invisible wall supporting trembling hearts. But the church was not only a place of tranquility, but also a center of power and knowledge in a time when schools had vanished and cities had disintegrated. Monasteries became repositories of ancient books, guarded by monks like a sacred fire that must never be extinguished. While villages slumbered in fear, a man in a candlelit room wrote down the words of philosophers and scholars who had come before, trying to preserve them from being swallowed up by the night. The sound of the bells was not only a call to prayer, but also a declaration that some light was still possible. Yet the night remained stronger, swallowing the bells themselves in a long silence, so that each person would return to their bed, besieged by their own fear. Outside the fortress walls, the roads stretched out like deserted threads. Between forests and plains, what were once the arteries of the great Roman Empire are now cracked ruins, covered in mud in winter and dust in summer. Traveling in those times was like risking one's life. The road was not merely a distance to be traversed, but a long test of fear and patience. During the day, you might be accompanied by a small caravan of merchants, camels, or horses laden with salt and grain. But when the light faded, eyes would shrink to the faintest flame, and the group would scatter among the trees. Night would swallow them one by one. Highwaymen were a constant specter on the road's hungry men, some fleeing wars, others starvation, hiding among the trees, pouncing on the first lone passerby. Mercy was not part of their code, only the sword and plunder did. Even the wind that whipped through the roads sounded like a terrifying whistle. Travelers swore they heard in it the voices of lost souls. Travel meant taking risks. You might arrive, or you might not. Therefore, everyone who left their village at a foggy dawn bid farewell to their family as if going into battle, and whoever returned safely was welcomed as if they had returned from death itself. This long night, myths were not a luxury but a necessity. When certainty fades, imagination becomes another wall protecting the soul from collapse. Around hearths and between weak fires swaying in the wind, peasants gathered to tell tales of life about unseen creatures, about phantom knights roaming the roads, and about wolves that, on moonlit nights, transformed into bloodthirsty humans. From the forests sprang tales of old witches who gathered at crossroads to practice mysterious rituals. From the ruins emerged stories of genies, ghouls, and treasures hidden beneath the rubble of ancient temples. Each story carried within it a genuine fear of the unknown that surrounded them and of death that walked among them faceless. But the story itself offered solace to its listeners, making fear something to be told, something to be contained by words. Even knights and nobles were not immune to these myths. In the halls of castles, they passed on tales of knights who never returned from their campaigns, or of shields haunted by spirits. They wore them and died in them, and so the night in Europe became not only a stage for fear but also for imagination. The night gave birth to myth, and myth gave people a reason to stay awake or a reason to surrender to sleep, guarding their dreams from the shadows. When everything is still, the night begins to speak. Silence in the Dark Ages was not absolute, but a mixture of small sounds, each capable of sowing terror in the heart. Peasants lay on mattresses of rough straw, their ears pressed against the outside. A door creaked in the wind, a distant dog barking, growing louder then suddenly ceasing, the sound of unknown footsteps on the mud, or the rustling of leaves suggesting a passing shadow. In the forest, howling filled the void. The howling of wolves was not a mere passing sound but a clear message. "We are here." They knew that a whole pack roamed in the darkness, and that any broken door could mean a direct confrontation with hungry fangs. Even inside castles, the night was not reassuring. Iron chains hung from the walls and doors heavy, it closes slowly, making a clang, and the sounds of the wind as it crashes against the towers create moaning tones. But in the monasteries, the night was broken by the monotonous sounds of chanting, like a wall of voices against an invincible darkness. This is how people lived with the night. Every sound was a sign, every movement a warning, and every breath passed between moments of apprehension. Sleep was nothing but a timid surrender, like someone laying their head on a pillow out of fear, hoping only the light of dawn would awaken them. Fire was man's first friend in the Dark Ages. It wasn't merely warmth for bodies, but a wall of light standing between people and darkness. In villages, when daylight faded, hearths were lit in huts, and families huddled around a small flame that offered them a measure of peace. Gold danced on pale faces, bestowing upon them a fleeting life before it withered away. Fire was the center of stories. Legends were told beside it, and people wove their fantasies nearby. The trembling light on the walls created mysterious shapes: a wolf suddenly crossing, a knight vanishing, or a phantom waving its hands. Fire itself possessed a spirit that played with the imaginations of those who stayed awake in castles. Hearths were wider and grander. Their flames devoured entire logs, roaring like a small battle, while knights and nobles gathered around them, and between a cup of wine and the faint sound of a flute transformed the fire into the beating heart of the castle. In the monasteries, fire was another symbol, a silent flame glowing in the corners like the eye of God watching over the monks in their prayers. But no matter how high the fire rose, it could not completely banish the darkness. It was merely a small island in the sea of night. And whenever it died down, fear would return and spread. Therefore, people were careful to keep it burning until dawn, because extinguishing it meant opening their doors to darkness without resistance. The castles, those enormous stone blocks that rose above the hills, appeared by day as impregnable fortresses, but by night they became like dark caves, breathing the fear of their inhabitants. From afar, the towers appeared like frozen ghosts standing silently against the wind, while the fire dancing on their walls was but a tiny speck against the sea of darkness that surrounded them. Inside the castle, night seeped into every corner. The long corridors grew colder, and the spiral staircases echoed with footsteps lost in the walls. Even the armored knights, those who by day appeared like a wall of iron, were at night only men huddled around the hearth, drinking and talking slowly about past battles and the ghosts some swore they had seen in the abandoned towers. The cellars, where grain and meat were stored, were another world altogether: thick darkness, cold dampness, and a smell mingled with the remnants of food and the fear of running out in the long winter. High in the towers, Where the guards slept, the night was harsher. The wind whipped against them, and any glimmer in the forest might be mistaken for an approaching raid. The castle was a refuge from chaos, but at the same time, it was a prison. Its walls protected, yes, but they also besieged, making everyone within hear the night as if it were knocking on the stone doors. And so the castles remained dual symbols: security and terror, strength and fragility, a small fire against an endless sea. When winter came, night in Europe became absolute master. The days were short, like stifled breaths, and the sun appeared only as a pale disk behind heavy gray clouds, then quickly disappeared, leaving the earth to a long, merciless night. Snow covered the fields and roads. Everything is white and still. Behind that stillness lurked cruelty. Huts were tightly shut, and hearths burned incessantly, yet fingers remained stiff and chests heavy with cold. People used to say that winter nights weren't measured in hours, but in stories told by the fire, in prayers whispered in the darkness, and in heavy footsteps counted until dawn. In castles, winter was another test. Storehouses were opened cautiously, food distributed by weight, and every feast could mean deprivation later. Even armored knights, accustomed to facing swords, found themselves helpless against a frost that seeped through the very stones. Forests transformed into white labyrinths where paths vanished, leaving the traveler unsure whether he was heading towards his village or veering away forever. During those long months, night stretched across Europe like a heavy blanket, leaving people with nothing but silent waiting for winter to depart, for the sun to return, for the grip of darkness to be broken. Hunger was a constant companion of Europe's dark nights. When the castle storehouses ran dry, or when the farmer couldn't harvest enough grain, the night would turn towards a tougher test. The cold could be endured by fire, and fear could be soothed by stories, but hunger knew no solace. In the huts, mothers would break a piece of dry bread into small pieces, offering it to the children as if it were a feast. Sometimes the soup contained nothing but water and some wild herbs, yet it was distributed with such seriousness as if it were the last thing the family possessed. The moans did not come only from the forest, but also from the empty stomachs of children who slept with tears on their cheeks. In the castles, the situation was not always better. The banquets held in the grand halls were quickly extinguished if the winter lasted long or the trade routes were cut off. The nobles themselves feared that hunger would devour their soldiers, leaving the sword without an arm and the castle without a guardian. Hunger made the night longer. Every minute that passed on an empty stomach felt like an hour, and every sound in the darkness became clearer. The ear tried to forget the body's cry. Even dreams were not spared. They dreamt of bread with meat, of dishes they had only seen in stories. Thus, hunger was not merely deprivation, or rather another shadow added to the shadows of night. Wars in the Dark Ages were not always grand campaigns between mighty kingdoms. Often, they were small, simmering conflicts between two neighboring villages or between two feudal lords squabbling over land boundaries or fields of wheat. At night, smoke rose from burning huts, women's cries mingled with the howls of dogs, and the sky transformed into a red dome of raging flames. There were no organized armies like those of kings, but rather bands of men armed with spears and axes who stormed houses, looted storehouses, and left behind a terror that wouldn't easily be extinguished. The villages awoke to a heavy silence after the raid, broken doors, dried blood on the mud, and deserted fields awaiting a hand. Night concealed the chaos, but it also preserved it in people's memories, transforming over time into stories passed down through generations about enemies who always came in the darkness. Even knights, imagined as heroes, often became pawns in these conflicts. Their armor gleamed under the moon, but their swords fell upon defenseless peasants, not mighty foes. Thus, night became a silent witness to unglorious wars and petty conflicts that erupted in the shadows, leaving Europe more broken with each new dawn. Despite all this fear, markets continued to emerge like small islands of life amidst a sea of darkness. By day, travelers and merchants arrived laden with salt, honey, iron, and colorful fabrics from distant lands. People gathered in the dusty squares, haggling, exchanging goods, and feeling, for a moment, that they were part of a world larger than their isolated village. But when the sun set, the scene changed. The simple shops closed, the torches were extinguished, and the merchants began to quickly pack up their loads, for night, for them, was not merely a time of rest. But a new danger loomed. Bandits lurked outside the walls, wolves approached the edges of the villages, and the cold seeped in from every direction. The travelers camped around small fires at the roadside, guarding their caravans with half-closed eyes. Some dozed off in their saddles, others clutched their swords to their chests, as if for a pillow of security. The sounds were the murmur of a nearby stream, the clatter of hooves lost in the darkness, or the whistling of wind passing through the bundled goods. Every small detail was capable of turning tranquility into panic. Yet the caravans continued, for the market was a necessity of life, and fear was a price that had to be paid. Thus, the night became a constant companion to the merchants, a perpetual enemy, but also a partner in the journey. Amidst this heavy night, other means of resistance were born for the poor and the peasants, not swords or fortresses, but songs, chants, and stories. When the sun set and people gathered around a weak fire, a deep voice would rise, singing slowly, followed by other voices echoing after it, as if weaving a wall of their own voices. The cold and fear were both repelled. The songs were simple, speaking of the harvest, the horse, the distant lover, and the safe return from the forest. Yet, within their lyrics, they carried great solace. Each melody reminded listeners that they were still human, capable of singing despite hunger and danger. In the monasteries, the night echoed with the sounds of chants. The monks sang in a language foreign to their ears, but its impact filled hearts with something akin to tranquility. The sounds echoed in the ancient stone halls like an eternal reverberation, proclaiming that there was something deeper than the night and the darkness. Even children had their own songs, short lullabies they whispered as they drifted off to sleep, perhaps to ward off nightmares of the forest. And so the night itself became a stage for art, where melodies and poems were born and passed down from generation to generation. Dark Europe sang in the gloom not to dispel it, but to learn how to live within it, and when the night grew so long that it seemed to never end, dawn began slowly, like a small miracle. The first gray line appeared on the horizon, followed by a pale blue, then the sun's rays slid through the mist like trembling threads. At that moment, the peasant breathed deeply, as if his chest had been freed from a heavy stone. Roosters crowed in the villages, and dogs barked more freely, as if announcing that the ghosts had returned to their dens. Children emerged from their huts with weary faces, but they laughed simply because the light had returned. Even the knights in the castles seemed more resolute, re-straightening their swords and preparing for a day that might be no less dangerous, but at least it was the dawn. It wasn't just a new day, but a temporary respite, a truce granted by time before night returned with its dominion. People greeted it with gratitude, sometimes with prayers, or simply with reassuring silence. Merchants and travelers saw in it the beginning of new activity, an opportunity to cross the road before sunset arrived again. But deep down, they knew this light was fleeting, that night would return and knock on the doors once more. And so, my friend, with the sleepless one, our journey through the dark night of Europe was complete. We passed between cold castles and villages huddled in fear. We crossed forests that gave birth to legends and heard the howls of wolves mingling with the sounds of bells and hymns. We saw knights with their stoic faces and trembling spirits, and peasants with their small dreams and weary bodies. We learned that night was not merely the absence of the sun, but the absence of all certainty. But as you saw, even in the darkest of times, there remain people light fires, sing, share stories, and cling to a faint glimmer of light that reminds them that dawn will always come, no matter how long the night. Now slowly close your eyes and imagine that distant bells are ringing just for you, not to announce a new fear, but to grant you rest. Sleep now, for the night is no longer darkness, but a soft blanket that carries you away until the sun of your dreams rises upon you.